last fall and was postponed due to the appearance of a young lady named Sandy. And here I am now. Hope the same thing doesn't happen again. You can imagine, for me, it's rather a strange thing to come back here after many years, and possibly for the last time, to give a program like this. I have a daughter who lives in Vermont, and one day she ran into a person up there. I won't go into all the details of how that came about, but it turns out that he grew up in Chester in the 1950s, maybe into the early 1960s. He lived down in Hacklebarney Way, and he, without being prompted, said to her that that was the best time and place to grow up that anyone could ever have. And she was startled, and she said, "You know, my father says the same thing all the time." And I still believe it. So whatever else did or did not happen in our lives, we were fortunate to live in the golden age. Now, I didn't personally live in Chester itself. I'm not one of these people who can walk up and down Main Street and tell you the present and historic names of the houses. In fact, I didn't live in Chester Township at all. We lived just over the line in Randolph, only because my parents had never owned a house before, and they bought this shack out there, and it just so happened to be in one township and not another, and they didn't really know the difference. The first time I saw Chester, I came down to play a ball game for the Ironia against a team from Chester in the ball field that used to be in the center of town. And when I first saw Chester Village in those years, I was astonished. It made a really strong impression because it was like walking into it was something unworldly about it. It was like walking into a different dimension, like walking through a curtain and coming into a different dimension of time. And it really must have been a powerful impression, because there I was, maybe 12 years old, not the most sensitive person in the world, and yet this feeling really was noticeable, that I was walking back into the past. And it was only many years later, when I started doing research, that I understood why it looked that way. Because, as the book says, that was Chester's Iron Heyday in the last 30 years of the 1800s. That was the peak period in Chester, when it was the most economically active, vibrant, population increasing, people were optimistic, and a lot of the buildings were built in that period. So it preserved the appearance of a 1880s town on into the period when I first saw it. Not because anybody deliberately tried to preserve it, or not because anyone thought it was cute and charming, or because there was some way to make money out of it, but just because they left it alone, and that's the way it stayed. And you can still see some evidence of that today. And it was that same period as when the railroads came to Chester, again because of the iron industry. I really think that if it had not been for the iron mines that sprang up around Chester, it's unlikely that railroads ever would have come over here, or at least if they did, it would not have been by the same route. They might have eventually extended the Gladstone branch up this way and maybe entered Chester by that route, but Chester would not have had the rail network that it did. Actually, at one period, the Lackawanna Railroad actually studied extending the Gladstone branch, or the P&D as rail fans call it, up to Chester, and they surveyed several different routes, but they finally decided not to do that. Let's switch to the general railroad map.
Don't forget your pointer.
Good point. So now, I regret to inform you, I'm finally coming to the subject matter I'm supposed to be talking about. The interesting thing about Chester railroads is that you could summarize the history of it in one paragraph, and it would be accurate. There were two main rail systems in the region. Both entered Chester. They had branches that came into Chester. One was the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, which people in town commonly called the Lackawanna. And the other one was the Central Railroad of New Jersey, which they commonly referred to as the Central. And we know pretty much when they arrived, sometimes to the exact date that the first train ran, and we know also when the service ended, in some cases to the exact day. So you can write a paragraph stating that, as I just did, and it's true. It's accurate as far as it goes, but it only is going to one superficial level, and there's really a lot more to the railroads in Chester than just that brief summary. So, this green line coming down here up to this point is the Lackawanna Chester branch. It was chartered as the Chester Railroad. It goes up and meets the main line of the DL&W west of Wharton, what they call, to this day, still call Chester Junction. And that railroad was opened in the first days of 1869. So that was the Lackawanna, and that was as far as it ever went. It went down to the depot, which is near around Oakdale Road, and that was it. Everything else, all the other rail lines that you see here in Chester, whenever they were built and operated, they were all part of the Jersey Central system. They connected with the Lackawanna at one time, but it was all part of the Jersey Central. Even with that, even having said that, there are still a lot of mysteries, uncertainties that we're not sure of. For example, in Frances Greenwich's scrapbook that you're all familiar with, she quotes someone, some old-timer, as saying that the railroad came into town because a man was digging a cellar on Main Street. Perry Skellenger, I think was his name, was digging a cellar and found iron ore while he was doing this excavation. And that set off an iron mining boom where everybody took their magnetic compasses, and before long they found iron all along the ridge, which is easy enough to do because the whole area has these iron pods underground. So that makes a nice story. She said that took place in 1867. The problem with that theory is that the Chester Railroad was chartered April 2nd, 1867. And in those days, the state legislature only met for a few weeks in the beginning of every year. I suppose a lot of people might wish it was still like that. Anyway, when they introduced that piece of legislation, it would have had to be introduced probably in January to allow time to process it, even though there was no real opposition. So there was not really time for, if iron was discovered in 1867, there was really not time to lead to chartering that railroad in April 1867. So there's some other factor going on here. It may be that the date 1867 is wrong. Maybe the iron was discovered a year or two earlier. Or another factor might be that the person who was behind organizing this Chester Railroad was Daniel Budd, and he had an interest in the Hacklebarney area, which was actually an older mining district, and there was also a forge down there going back into the 1700s. So maybe he wanted a railroad to serve that area. Another possibility, which is an interesting clue that I came up with doing my research, is this curved hook that runs over there. It shows up only on the 1868 County Atlas. You will never see it anywhere else. 1868 is the exact time they were building the Chester Railroad. And I suspect that Daniel Budd wanted to extend the Chester Railroad over this way to pick up a railroad that he had an interest in, which I think was called the Flanders and German Valley. You all know what German Valley is? Yeah. Same thing before it was sauerkraut. You know, during World War I, because it was German, they renamed sauerkraut Liberty Cabbage. And so the German Valley became and remained Long Valley. So Daniel Budd had an interest in building, in connecting with that railroad. It would have gone through, I forget the name of the gap, the same one pretty much that 206 now goes through, and hook up with a different railroad system. And maybe that would have helped support the Chester Railroad if it connected with some other entity. It was supposed to connect with the Longwood Valley Railroad, which was going to run all the way up the valley, almost up to the state line, New Jersey state line. So that's a clue, plus the fact that in its charter, the state charter, the Chester Railroad was allowed to make that connection. So that may be another clue. That leads into another interesting bit of information also contained in the scrapbook, to the effect that Daniel Budd wanted the Chester branch to come uphill, gradually climb up the hill out of the Black River Valley and come up somehow into the center village. And Nathan Cooper, who was another powerful figure at that time in Chester history, had an opposite opinion, and he wanted it to stay down in the river valley, Black River Valley, which it did. In doing my research later on, I found out that the story is true, but the characters were reversed. In other words, Daniel Budd wanted the route to stay down here because then it could make this connection and also come down to Hacklebarney without going uphill and downhill. It was a lot easier to stay in the valley. And it was Nathan Cooper that didn't want it there. He didn't want it to cross. He owned a piece of land. Here's Cooper Mine. His land extended down to the river. And he tried to block this and run it up this way where it would come closer to his property. At one time, there was a big celebration in town, and they burned an effigy, and the effigy said, "General Injunction," because he tried to get an injunction to stop the building of this railroad because he didn't like the route. And the reason they called it General Injunction was that he was a general in the state militia, and he was extremely proud of that rank. If you go up to his grave in Pleasant Hill Cemetery, the footstone says simply General. Although it's an interesting fact that during the Civil War, he would have been in the prime of life in his 50s, and he showed no interest in commanding troops and going off to that war. So he and Daniel Budd were the two outstanding men in the whole history of Chester, and they were born only 2 years apart. They sometimes worked together, but sometimes they were rivals. And in this case, Daniel Budd won, and the railroad went where he wanted it to, which remained in the valley. Just as a footnote, many years later, the DL&W, Lackawanna, surveyed different routes that would correct the original route and do more of what Nathan Cooper wanted, which is to leave the existing line somewhere around what we used to call Hortontown and gradually climb up the ridge. And we have actually a map down there that shows some of the survey routes, but again, they never built it. Now, the rest of the railroads in Chester, as I said, were part of the Jersey Central, CNJ, but they were not built in the order and in the reasons you might suspect from looking at the map. The map is deceptive. What led to the building of these lines is that in the town of Highbridge, there was a family named Taylor, and they owned an ironworks down there. And connected with that ironworks, they either bought or leased Hedges Mine, which is just behind here, right there. And so they wanted to get the ore from this mine down to Highbridge. So they chartered a railroad called the High Bridge Railroad to do that. But that's kind of a long distance. They didn't have money to do that immediately as soon as they wanted. So they thought instead of doing that, they would connect with the existing Lackawanna branch. So they needed to get from Hedges Mine down and up to meet the Chester branch. And also around that same time, they built the branch down to Hacklebarney. I forget which came first, if I ever knew. But anyway, they were built around the same time, 1872, 73. And they were built separate from anything in High Bridge. The only way that you could, the only outlet they had was by coming out this way and going out over the Lackawanna. After which, it was possible from here, Chester Junction, to go down to Washington and pick up what they call the old main of the Lackawanna, which was the Warren Railroad, and then come down to Hampton, and then come back to High Bridge. So it's a somewhat roundabout way of getting there, but it worked. It was usable to do that. And that was how these rail lines started out. It was only in 1876 that they started to build the connecting line, which is this piece from here all the way out to German Valley and then down to High Bridge. So there was like a 3-year gap between this railroad construction, and it's a confusing, obscure period, but a lot of things were going on in that brief period as far as laying out what became the Chester rail network. And it would help, I wish we knew more about what went on back then, but there are still a lot of questions remaining. So technically, the Chester branch of what became the Jersey Central extends from the DL&W Chester branch just down to here. And all the rest of this, from Long Valley all the way up to Hedges Mine, and then beyond it, it crossed the highway out here and went up to where the Chester Station, the CNJ Chester Station was, which is kind of in the parking lot for this shopping mall up at the intersection. So this was all called the Chester Hill branch. It was not the Chester branch. It's another interesting but obscure piece of history. And because this portion eventually was the only remaining part of the Jersey Central in Chester, naturally they called it the Chester branch and no longer called it the Chester Hill branch, which it legally was. And this Chester, the CNJ Chester branch, remained in some kind of service all the way up to 1962. One of the great regrets of my life is that I never came down and watched some of the last trains trying to run on it. So that's the story, and that seems to make sense. It looks like, when you see it on the map like this, two-dimensional map, it all runs together and makes sense. It's only when you start going out and looking at it on the ground, as so often happens, with the architects and archaeologists call ground truthing, where you go out and actually look at something and see if it behaves the way it's supposed to, then different problems start coming up. Let's try the furnace rail slide. Okay.
This one?
Yep, that's the one. This is a somewhat larger version of a section of the same map that we showed you before. So here's the so-called Chester Hill branch running to Hedges Mine and then on up right behind here. And here's the old Chester branch running up to the Lackawanna. Here's the Hacklebarney branch running to Hacklebarney. And the connecting Chester Hill branch, 1876, that went down to Long Valley, German Valley, and beyond. So again, when you look at it like a map, and then I might as well mention at this point that Chester Furnace was built a few years later in here, starting 1879, and that had its own internal rail network serving the different parts of the furnace to bring the ore and charcoal or coal in and take out the finished pig iron and whatever else they needed to do. So that's this network of tracks in here, and according to this you can see it had connections running in both directions, so you could go out here and also out up toward the DL&W. So again, 2 dimensions, it makes sense, and when you look at it that way, no problems. It's only when you start looking at it on the ground that you notice something different is going on, and you can see it in this cross section. So here's the level of Chester Furnace. This is the grade of Chester Furnace. There's a retaining wall right here. This line, if you can see it, is the cross section that you're seeing here, if that makes sense. Then the loading track for the furnace, which is right here, is lower than the furnace. Then the branch, this branch here, that is the Chester branch running up to the DL&W, you can see is somewhat higher. And then the Chester Hill Railroad branch that runs uphill to the village of Chester is higher still. So what's going on here? You know that railroads, as they operate, can't take steps uphill the way we can. They have to operate on very gradual grades. The ideal railroad, if it could, would be perfectly flat, never have grades at all. They can handle 1% with little or no trouble, 2% is okay too. When you start getting up to 3% grade, it runs into more and more problems because it's less and less efficient. It takes either more power to move the load, or you have to have a smaller load with the same power, and it's inefficient, more costly. The CNJ in Chester had notoriously difficult grades at best. The line coming up out of Long Valley is a very difficult grade. It was very difficult to run trains up that, even without this problem that I'm talking about here. But the point being that there had to be some way, we know that it operated. In other words, the furnace operated not for too long, less than 10 years, but it was busy while it was running. And in those 10 years, loads were coming in and out all the time. So they had a way of moving trains around. And yet when you look at the ground, it doesn't seem to work because you don't see a point of connection. Like this track here doesn't connect at the same grade. And the same going out here. There's a grade change that today, we just, Joe led a walk down there last year, right?
Yeah.
And we were looking at that, and it was the first time I'd been back there in decades, and had never really looked at it from that point of view before, but in looking at it then, it was really difficult to see how this whole thing functioned. And really, I still don't know. It's still a mystery. When I was, of course, doing all this research, I read through the newspapers I think Dover was beginning to have a newspaper. Morristown certainly had newspapers. Chester didn't have its own newspaper. I read through week after week of all the newspapers. Frances Greenwich, when she wrote her book, looked through all the collections in the Historical Society. Nowhere is there any information to explain what was going on to account for how this thing really operated. So to this day, we haven't been able to resolve that question. Maybe that'll be a challenge for someone here in the audience. Before we go on, I want to interrupt with a commercial break. The excellent maps that you see, such as this one, are the work of my colleague sitting here, Joe McKasick, who I regard as sort of a genius at doing graphic representation of things. And he also leads walks on industrial subjects, iron manufacturing, charcoal manufacturing, and so on, for the county, pretty much every week during the summer. And there's a list of his programs on the back table, if anyone is interested. Now, the other part of this mystery that is an important clue is right here. If you can all see that, this is a very well-made, very impressive stone arch bridge that the railroad used to cross over the Black River. Right, this is it right at this point. So it's visually very pleasant and attractive. When you look at it more closely again, though, you see that there's an addition. This would have been the original capstones, and then from there up, which is actually a distance of 6 feet, it's obvious that the stonework is different, not as high quality. And you can see that here. This is the final grade with one track on it, and here was the original grade. 6 feet difference from there to there. So something's going on. And what is it? How do you account for that? Someone went to a lot of work to do this, and they must have had a reason for it. Okay, here's one possibility. Let's say, remember that before this connection was built, all they had was this and running up to Hedges Mine. So maybe the original part down here was only built, was built in 1872 just to get up to Hedges Mine and no further. When they're running up to Hedges Mine, all the traffic is downhill. All they're doing is mining ore, very heavy commodity, and taking it downhill. Gravity does the work. However, in 1876, when they build this connection and continue on up beyond Hedges Mine, then they're building a real railroad branch that they meant to have traffic in both directions. So they would need to have a smoother, a more manageable grade going uphill as well as downhill because they were running passenger service. Not that that's that heavy, but they like to keep the passenger train moving. And also they were bringing coal cars. There was a coal pocket out here for many years, and that's what people relied on for their homes and businesses, coal heating. So maybe what they were trying to do was smooth out the grade from here all the way uphill. And it may also be related to that, that if this was the original grade level, when they crossed Furnace Road, it may have been a grade crossing originally, and then when they built up 6 feet, and then also 6 feet here, and then gained a little distance from here to there, and smoothed out the rest of the grade going uphill, it may be that's when they put the bridge in for the overhead crossing of Furnace Road, where you can still see, or at least as of last year, things change so fast, I don't know, but at least as of last year, you can still see one abutment on Furnace Road. Now, in 1876, there was no furnace. I don't know what that road would have been called, but it was not Furnace Road, and all this track was not there. But just to get uphill, they might have wanted to improve the entire grade, which meant putting a bridge over Furnace Road that was, again, built out of stone, similar to this. Otherwise, if that was not the answer, then when you walk on this branch, you don't see an old line alongside the existing line, as you would if they just simply built a new one side by side. If they raised it or evened out the grade, they did it over the top of what was already there. And even in those days, when they could get things done a lot faster than today, in other words, in those years when the owners decided to do something, they just went ahead and did it. The only thing holding them back was money. Once they had the money, they went ahead and did it. But even then, it would have taken many months to do this work, to raise this bridge and to change the grade and possibly build another bridge over Furnace Road. No matter how they went at it, it would have meant closing the rail line for several months. So there's no record that any of us ever found to indicate that the Chester Hill branch was closed for an extended period. If they had closed it before this connection was built in 1876, it would not have mattered so much, because the only traffic they really had was the ore coming down from Hedges Mine, and they could simply let that accumulate and then haul it out once the train service was restored. But anyway, so that's a theory, but at this point there's no confirmation besides just the fact that I've expressed it. Hedges Mine, they bridged right over that. They built a wooden trestle right over the deep pit of Hedges Mine, and then they started filling in around the trestle. So now you see a solid railroad grade running across what had been Hedges Mine, and presumably the original wood trestle work, I would guess, is still buried in there, because when wood is sheltered from exposure to air and moisture, it can remain for a long time. If it didn't, you would see the grade sinking, which we don't observe happening. So I guess that trestle work is still likely to be in there. So this Jersey Central branch went on in service, as I mentioned, up to 1962, and they had passenger service all the way up to, I believe, 1928. In other words, you could get a train on the High Bridge branch anywhere, like from Dover. You could get on a train and come down to Long Valley and change to a train coming up the Chester branch, or get on the Jersey Central anywhere else and make that connection. The trouble is, in the last few years of that service, it only ran twice a week. So you could make a trip from Chester to Long Valley on Wednesday and remain till Saturday if you had enough to do in Long Valley. You could spend a little vacation there, or the opposite. It was what they called a mixed train, which is a train that's both freight and passenger. In other words, they would generally attach a decrepit old passenger coach or baggage coach onto the freight train and run it up and down the hill at a very slow rate of speed. And eventually they eliminated that in 1928. Maybe go back to the general slide, which is the railroad slide. There we go. So you had in Chester the two rail stations, the Central here and the Lackawanna there, and they made little or no effort that I know of, to coordinate their schedules, because if you were going from here to Dover, you would wind up only a few blocks apart in Dover, and the Lackawanna offered much better service. So it would only be if you wanted to go from some intermediate point, like St. Flanders to Chester, you could do it by coming up here from Long Valley on the Central. And this connection between the Lackawanna down here to the Furnace never had passenger service. So your choice was to come in on the Lackawanna or to come in on the Central and do what you were doing. There was also a station, while the Furnace was functioning, there was a little station stop right there at this junction, and it was possible to board the trains there as well. So the Lackawanna maintained a pretty good passenger service up until 1932 or 33, I think it was 33. They generally, over the years, ran 3 passenger trains a day. at one point they tried going to 4, and the traffic was not sufficient to justify doing that, so they gave it up. In the early years, the passenger service was, you would have to change from a mainline train at Dover and walk across the platform and pick up a Chester branch train and come out over the Chester branch, which stopped at Wharton, Kenville, Succossona, Ironia, and Horton, which was a shelter about 7 foot square. But it was there. And in later years, as far as I know, they started doing something different, which was at least one of the trains was a through train from Hoboken, in which it was run just like the Sussex branch or like the Gladstone branch, where it would originate in Hoboken and run all the way through to Chester and lay overnight in Chester and go back the next morning. So that means that in the closing years of passenger service, they would have had long passenger trains coming into Chester, and these would be, this was pre-electrification, they would be the same commuter coaches that you saw everywhere else on the Morrison Essex, as it was called. I'll talk about that in a minute. And they would come down to Chester. Now, it's not because Chester generated that much traffic, nor did Ironia, but it was just a destination for that train, and going down the line, it would pick up passengers all through the commuter district, the same way the trains from Dover or Morristown would. It's an interesting thing to think about, these long, fairly modern, impressive-looking commuter trains coming down to Chester. And there must